Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So today, I think we got a pretty good one. We got some good topics that we're going to cover today, which I think is pretty good. The one that you're definitely going to want to stick around for is the fact that a little-known dip for your chips, or something you put on your burritos, aka guacamole, is actually something you can also put in your Homelabs. Yes. Might sound weird, but we're going to get into that. But first, we got a little bit of a story time. So for this story time, it comes from my day job, and the IT department decided they were going to go full send to prod. So if you're unfamiliar with what any of that means, basically what it means is they full send, obviously, just, go ahead, no concern for anything, not a care in the world, just go for it. And then to prod, which is the cool, hip way, I guess you could say, that developers talk about production. So when you push something to production, if you push a code change to production, that means it's going to be available to the general public or the wider audience, not just for development and testing. So if you think about when you push like a website change, for example, like if you have a website and the quote-unquote send to prod would be when you actually update your front-facing website. So if your website was mywebsite.com, when you would make a change to mywebsite.com and it would be reflected on the mywebsite.com page, that would be a push to production or push to prod. If you had an internal server, like say you were running a server on your desktop or whatever that you were testing changes locally, that would be, and you push something to there, that would be like a push to development or a push to dev or something like that. So production is when it gets pushed so everyone can see it or everyone gets to download it. So if you're an IT department and you're pushing something to production, specifically like patches or security updates or something like that, you want to make sure they work first. That's generally a good practice. I mean, granted, not always, not everyone does it, but it's generally best practice to make sure that your updates and patches actually work and don't brick people's machines. And obviously by bricking a machine, we're just basically saying turning the machine into a paperweight or turning it into a brick because it can no longer function as a computer. And the same thing goes for software development too. You always want to make sure that your changes actually work before you push them. Even to like a development environment, you want to make sure that your changes don't break something. Now, obviously, a development environment, the point of pushing to a development environment is for testing to make sure it actually works. But you should at least be doing some, local testing and local checking to make sure that it's, actually generally works. I mean, granted, you're probably going to miss out on some edge cases, or maybe there's specific inputs or something, for example, that don't work as intended, but like basic stuff works. That's something that you could push to production, and then you can test and find out what the bugs are, and then eventually you get those bugs out, and then once your code has gone through all that process, then you push it to production. But if you want to go full madman, you can just full send to prod, and just who cares about testing and who cares about the process of getting the bugs out, because at the end of the day, it works on my machine, so it's all good. So remember, kids, if your code works on your machine, it's 100% bulletproof, nothing's wrong with it, and if anyone has any issues, it's their machine's fault, and your code is perfecto. At least that's what whoever in the IT department thought. because they pushed an update which not only bricked my computer, my work computer, but it also apparently bricked a lot of other people's work computers as well. Because when I noticed that I couldn't log into my computer, I called up the help desk and was like, explained them the issue and was like, yeah, I can't log into my computer, and, explain what's going on. And they're like, yeah, we're getting a lot of calls this morning about that. Apparently, someone pushed a patch or an update or something, and, a lot of people are having these issues. So specifically, what is that issue? So like most organizations, we use like an ID badge to get ourselves into the building, right? But one thing that we also do that some places do, but it's not quite as common, is we also use our badge to log into our computer. So we just kind of, put it in the computer and it logs us in. So how that technology works is there is an internal USB header on the computer itself, or you could use an external reader with an external USB to basically read the credentials on your card, and then it'll log you in. But the patch that was pushed disabled all USB ports, which you might see the issue here. If all USB ports are disabled, wouldn't that include the internal ones? You are absolutely correct. So if the internal USB port is disabled, that also disables the ability to be able to read our cards to allow us to log in. So our computer is essentially bricked and we have no way to log into it. So let's give a round of applause for the IT guy. So the stereotype here, of course, is that this is some, summer intern or something that, pushed his first change to production and is so hyped and so happy, and now he might not even be getting a chance to come back. Unfortunate. Now, obviously, I have no idea who pushed this change, if they were an intern, or if they were a seasoned vet, or, I don't know any of that. But, of course, the meme is, and the stereotype is, when something like this that completely bricks people's computers gets pushed to production, the stereotype is that it was just some intern or something that didn't know any better and went full send. Obviously I have no way of knowing if that's true, but what I do know is whoever pushed that change is definitely going to be getting an earful from other people on their team or their supervisor or the staff that has to go remote into all these bricked machines and re-enable the USB ports on them so they can actually log in, because they just created a ton of work for them. So that is for certain. They're going to be in for an earful, assuming they even still have their job, which I don't know if I guess I wouldn't necessarily say that because they pushed that they're instantly going to get fired, unless this has happened multiple times and they're a repeat offender of pushing bad things to production, then maybe. But if this is the first time, they're probably just going to get a stern talking to, which is probably not going to be a fun time for them. And it definitely wasn't a fun time for me and probably a lot of other people either, because, we didn't have our computer for the entire day, because I literally was about to leave for the day and I got a phone call from, the rep that was, remoting into the machine to fix it, asking me to talk about what the problem was. And, I told him, and then remotes into the machine, and literally within less than 30 seconds, he was like, yep, fix the problem, restarting your computer now, and just let me know when it comes back up. So this guy had to have had muscle memory down with how many of these issues he had to fix, or maybe he even had a script or something that auto fixed it for him. I don't know, but regardless, I thought it was pretty funny. The IT department going full send to prod, not even bothering, bricking a ton of people's machines, and causing a lot of work for the help desk people and the people that have to actually go in and fix the disaster that they caused. But if it was, so going back to this hypothetical, if it was, the stereotypical quote unquote student intern, I honestly kind of feel bad for them, because like if it's your first time ever like pushing, your changes to production, like that's a big deal. Like, having the first time that something that you wrote is actually being pushed and going to be used by a lot of people, like that's big. That's huge. And to have your first thing that you push just be absolutely catastrophic and destroying, people's productivity for an entire day, and just this mass, I don't even know like the adjective, to describe it. Not destruction, but the complete and utter failure of this push. Like that's just got to be so demoralizing, right? Like you're at the end of your day. You've pushed your change to production. You're feeling really good. You come in the next day and you realize that same change you pushed just bricked like half the company, or a third, or 2/3, or whatever the number is, computers, because of the change that you pushed. Man, that's gotta hurt. And then that earful that you're gonna get afterwards, ooh, I do not envy that person. That is for sure. So, moral of the story here, if you're gonna be pushing anything to production, make sure that you actually test it on multiple machines, multiple devices, multiple platforms, multiple operating systems, whatever you're planning to deploy this to, make sure you're testing it on thoroughly so something like this doesn't happen. And don't be giving the "it works on my machine" excuse, because that's not good enough. But I will say, if you do want to become a meme on your company's Slack channel, or become a meme on the front page of r/programmer humor, then by all means, 100% full send your code to production. Don't even bother testing it. Heck, don't even bother running any tests. Just hit the build button. As soon as it builds and compiles successfully, push it. Don't even, doesn't matter if as soon as you run it, it just errors out and breaks. Push it. That's what you do. If you want to become the meme, you push your trash code to production. Sure, you might lose your job, and everyone's going to hate you, and IT's going to hate you because you created so much work for them having to patch all these systems and fix the mess you made. But, you're getting the meme glory. You're becoming a meme. And isn't that worth it? Now, obviously, I hope you can hear the sarcasm in my voice, and please don't do that. Please. So yeah, that was the story time. Good fun times this week. That is for sure. So now let's get into the dip/topping for your burrito, guacamole, that you can also use in your Homelab. Yes. So there is a piece of software out there called Apache Guacamole, and basically what it is it's essentially a remote management console, like on the web, like as a web browser that you can run in your Homelab environment. And what it allows you to do is you can connect remotely to all of your virtual machines, all of your desktops, laptops, whatever. It has compatibility for a load of different protocols. SSH, which is secure shell, like command line stuff. Telnet, which is essentially the same thing as SSH, but it's not encrypted, so don't use that unless you want everyone seeing every single command that you send to a remote machine, which you don't want to have happen, trust me. And then it also has things for like remote desktop protocols like RDP, which is like what Windows uses for their remote desktop. And then it also has VNC also, which is another kind of remote desktop application as well. So what you can do is you can configure this to you can configure like the IP and the username and password of a remote machine, and whether you're connecting through VNC, RDP, SSH, whatever you're connecting to, and then you have access to that through the web browser that you can access this machine remotely. So you could be on, say, your mobile phone, whether you're on Android or iPhone, you can navigate to wherever this server is running, its IP address, and you can connect to it, and then you can have full access to your entire Homelab from the palm of your hand, which is really cool and really powerful. Obviously, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, just for the sense that in my experience using it and using like remote desktops on my phone, it's generally not the best experience, mainly because the phone screen's so darn small. So trying to like navigate around with the phone screen, sure, it's doable, but it's just kind of a pain and kind of an inconvenient, and I'd much rather just have a laptop or, a desktop or some kind of larger screen that I can, more easily navigate and maneuver around a remote session like that. But regardless, it is so nice. Like, you don't even need to have a computer with anything installed. As long as it has a web browser, you can connect to your entire stack in your data center, aka Homelab, and without issue. Like, you could be using a trash book, aka Chromebook, that can only connect to the internet, and without any, because it's a trash book, it doesn't run anything natively. So you can't install things like, an RDP client or a VNC client, or heck, I don't even know if Chromebooks have SSH abilities on them. They might. I don't know. But regardless, it doesn't matter, because you can just go to the web address of your server that's running this Apache Guacamole, and you can remote access, remote manage everything. So the really cool thing about this is you could have a massive powerhouse of like a workstation, like at your house or something, or in your server rack, or wherever you want it, and then you could have, as long as you have remote access to it, you can be anywhere. If you have a cool bomb and Homelab setup, and you have a VPN that you can connect to back to your Homelab, you could literally be anywhere in the world and remotely access that device, connect into the VPN, go to Guacamole, access the device, and you got all that power either in the palm of your hand, like on your phone, or maybe you're on like a tablet or something, or maybe you're chilling, on the beach with a laptop or something that isn't that powerful, but you can still have all that power in the palm of your hand or on your lap, or, whatever the case may be. And you don't have to worry about like actually being right in front of the device. And the other thing that's really cool about it too is if you have, say, a server rack like I do, and you have, a whole bunch of computers, you don't need to necessarily like plug, a monitor and mouse and keyboard into the device that you're trying to access. You can just connect to it remotely through a web browser, which is like as convenient as it gets, pretty much. Now, obviously, for some things, it is limited in the sense that if you want to reboot a system and access the BIOS and all that good stuff, obviously you can't do that with this tool, because in order for those remote sessions like SSH, VNC, RDP, in order for those to work, you actually have to be booted into the operating system. So if you actually wanted a solution where you could access like the BIOS and all that stuff, you would need some kind of KVM solution, which is essentially a way that you can access the computer, and you can even get access to the BIOS and things like that. So one common thing that you'll see is like enterprise servers. For example, they have like a lights out management port. They call them different things. And HP's line, it's like ILO, I think, which is like integrated lights out. Dell's version is iDRAC. There's multiple different versions. IPMI is like just the base standard, which is just a way for you to like pull data from a server even if it's powered off, which is definitely really cool. But in these softwares, what you can do is you can get a virtual console essentially, which will act like a KVM in the sense that you can access the BIOS screen even if you're not physically at the machine. But in real terms, what an actual dedicated KVM would do would plug directly into the machine, and then you would have like a little console thing, which kind of looks like, if you're using a rack mounted version, it kind of looks like a laptop basically, that you can open it and it has a screen and you can change between which input you want to use. So if you want to use say your server 1, you can click a button to get server 1's screen, and then you get a full mouse, or I say mouse, which is really a trackpad, and then a keyboard that you can interact physically with the hardware and the server, and that way you would be able to get a BIOS that way. But generally, at least in my experience, I don't really find myself needing to access the BIOS of a computer all that often, and that's like, in my rack, for instance. So that's not, so I really haven't had the need for a dedicated KVM like that, which can like slide into my rack, and then I can open it up and access the different whichever server I want to access. And honestly, the only use that a KVM like that for me personally would be for accessing the BIOS, because all my servers that I run, aside from like I think aside from 2 computers that I run, which are literally just desktop computers that I converted into quote-unquote servers. One of them runs a desktop version of Linux, and one of them runs Windows. Aside from those, all the other servers in my rack just boot into a command line, which I can remote into anyway. So having a dedicated KVM that I can, physically access the video output through this console like in the rack is kind of pointless for the majority of my use case, because like I said, I don't really have a need for accessing it unless I need to get to the BIOS. So as much as I want to add a KVM into my rack, and I think it'd be really, really cool, the need just really isn't there, because like I mentioned, 2 of my servers that I have run Proxmox, which is a hypervisor, and it just boots into a command line interface. And then my other server runs TrueNAS, which again also boots into a command line interface. So there's really no need for a KVM. So as much as I would definitely like to get one, I don't know if I'll really see it happening anytime soon. But bringing this all the way back to Guacamole, that's kind of the nice thing about that is I can, the VMs that I run on my Proxmox servers that actually do have video output, I couldn't even access those anyway if I had a, dedicated KVM. But with Guacamole, I can access them just fine. And because they're running as VMs in Proxmox, if for whatever reason I needed to get to their BIOS screen, if you will, it's not, I guess it's kind of a BIOS. If I needed to get to that screen, like, the pre-boot screen to like change like configuration settings there, which generally I never have to do, but in a hypothetical sense I could just log into the Proxmox web console and do it that way. So because it's running in a VM, I wouldn't even be able to access it through the KVM. So it would, again, kind of make it pointless. But like I said, Guacamole, if you have a Homelab, I would definitely recommend, if you don't have it installed anyway, I would definitely recommend setting it up and installing it, since it is a very, very cool tool. And speaking of my Homelab, we have some updates. I have bought 2 new computers. One of them I actually have to build and put together. I bought it as like a bare bones thing. Those parts haven't arrived yet, but it should be a pretty cool server. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on it and playing around with it. The other one is running a desktop version of Linux, and really the main point of this guy was for me to have a server. I say server, which then again, any computer can be a server. It doesn't have to be a specifically rack-mounted thing. So just it's just like a terminology difference. But the main reason I got this was, have a dedicated system that when I'm, away from home and I only have my phone, say, for example, I can easily remote in and do all the remote management stuff I would normally do from, say, one of my normal computers, like, say, my Mac Mini, which is kind of like my quote-unquote everyday, daily driver, if you will, that I have, like, on my desk, which I have all my, like, remote management stuff like Ansible installed. So the point of this Linux desktop was, is now a server, was to be able to have that capability to remotely manage my entire network and server stack remotely, without actually having access to any of my other computers. And so far, I've had that up and running for a few days now, and it's honestly been working spectacularly. I cannot be happier with it. And the other thing that I like about it is, rather than most of the servers that I run in virtual machines, where I just run a server OS without actually having a GUI on it, so there's no, like, graphical user interface. The only way I can access it is through, like, a command line. This, I actually installed a desktop to it, so I can actually remote in through a virtual desktop application like VNC or RDP, and actually have a full Linux desktop if I actually need to do anything with the desktop, which is really cool, and I'm definitely enjoying it for sure. But since I mentioned I was getting some new parts in to build a server, I came to I guess I didn't come to this realization, I already knew this, but it came back to me that, like, sometimes the most expensive part of a server build, or even a computer build for that matter, especially if you're going on the used market, which, if you're dealing with a Homelab, unless you're some bougie rich kid that is willing to spend thousands, or most likely tens of thousands, on brand new enterprise hardware, you're going on the used market. And buying used components like that, specifically RAM, is absurd. Like, this recent build that I configured, I kid you not, the RAM that I put in, the RAM that I got was essentially half of what the total server cost, which is kind of crazy. Now, I guess the thing with the RAM is, RAM prices, they really haven't changed, like, at all. Like, when was it? So the first time I built a server was like 2 years ago, and I bought a 64 gigabyte kit of ECC registered RAM running at like 1600 megahertz, I believe. And back then, you could get 64 gigs of that kind of RAM for around $100. And obviously, 2 years later, DDR3 is even more outdated, since back then DDR4 was, the big thing, and now in 2022, DDR5 is starting to come out, and you're seeing systems running with DDR5. So DDR4 is the old guy, and DDR3 is the really old guy. But if you look online for a 64 gigabyte kit of ECC RAM at 1600 megahertz, it's still like around $100. Like, what the heck? And then if you want to go anything more than that, like, 128 or 256 or anything like that, it just, like, doubles. Like, it's insane. Like, so if you're just trying to build a system and you don't need much RAM, it's not that big of an issue. But, like, if you're trying to do something like I am, and you want a system that can do virtualization and, like, run something like Proxmox or some other hypervisor, you need RAM. You can't get around the fact that you need RAM. And usually when you're, creating a hypervisor build like this, your limiting factor generally isn't your CPU power. It's generally your RAM capacity. You run out of RAM way quicker than you run out of CPU power, usually. Unless you're, allocating, like, half your cores to, like, one VM. But even then, if you allocate a ton of your CPU resources to one virtual machine, unless you got that thing running compute, like, virtually nonstop, and it's mostly going to be idling a lot of the time. Like if I look at, my Proxmox, web app, and it shows me stats like what my utilization is. My utilization is like almost always well below 5%. Like it's around like, 2-3% utilization. And keep in mind, I'm running, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I'm probably running at least 10, if not more VMs constantly, that they're always up 24/7. And I'm only using like 1-2%, like, 2-3% utilization of the CPU, which obviously I'm allocated, if you actually break it down, obviously well more than 2-3% of the CPU is allocated to those VMs. But if you look at the RAM usage is, way higher than that because, you obviously need RAM. So that's usually your limiting factor if you're trying to do a virtualization build. RAM is generally the limiting factor, which really stinks because RAM is always, like, compared to everything else, RAM is always the most expensive. Like, especially if you're going on older platforms, like if you're a big one that a lot of people in the Homelab community love is the LGA 2011 platform, which if you're unfamiliar, all that means LGA 2011, that's just like the term for the socket that a CPU uses. So for example, if I have a CPU that is made for the LGA 2011 socket, it'll work on this platform. But if I have something that's, say, LGA 1366, it won't work. So that the whole LGA 2011 is just, the type of socket and what kind of CPUs will work for it. But anyway, if you're using, say, that platform, CPUs are pretty darn cheap. Like, the CPUs that I bought, I got 2 of them for, I kid you not, $14. $14 for 2 CPUs, enterprise-level CPUs, with each having, I believe it's 8 cores and 16 threads for $14. I mean, that is... If that ain't depreciation, I don't know what is. Like, those CPUs when they were new, easily in the $2,000 range. But now, $14. And I should also mention that $2,000 range, that was just for one of them. And I got 2 of them for $14. So, yeah. And then, of course, there's the RAM that's like, I mentioned a 64 gigabyte kit is, almost $100. So, like... You got 32 cores, so 32 essentially cores, which are, logical cores. Physical cores, you got 16. So if you're unfamiliar with how that works, CPUs generally, not all, but a lot of them will have what's called hyper-threading, which allows you to have one physical core, and then with that one physical core, you get 2 what they call logical cores. So in this example, I have a 8-core CPU, which has 8 physical CPU cores, and then each one of those 8 cores has 2 logical processors that can act like cores. So while you only have 8 physical, you essentially get 16. So that's basically how that works. So, you're getting 32 cores that you can run all of your VMs on, but you're limited when it comes to RAM. And it's always the limiting factor is the RAM, and the RAM is always insanely expensive. That and storage. Although if you're building a virtualization build like this, storage pales in comparison to RAM, unless you're making a massive, for whatever reason you're making a massive amount of storage because you want your VMs all to have, like, I don't know, 256 or a terabyte of storage, which personally I don't know why you would ever do that. Most of my VMs I think run like maybe 32 gigabytes, maybe 40, maybe 64, like, because if you're running a virtual machine, to run a specific process, like going back to Guacamole, for example, if you're running a virtual machine just to run Guacamole, you don't need, like a desktop level amounts of processing power and RAM for that. You don't need, 8 cores and 16 gigabytes or 32 gigabytes of RAM. Like, give that thing 1 or 2 cores maybe, and like a gig of RAM, something like that. But obviously, if you're running, like I run a couple of, development environments, so I can do like code testing and whatnot. In those cases, I'm obviously going to give them more RAM and more compute power, since, they'll need them when I deploy code to do testing and whatnot. But yeah, it's just something that I came back to realize, that if you're trying to do a virtualization build, you'll price out all the components before your RAM, and you're like, man, this is a cheap build, I can do this. And then you price out the RAM, and you're like, well, shoot, my price just doubled. So if you're trying to do a build like this, where you're wanting to do some kind of virtualization, if you don't pick the RAM first, see what your total comes out to before you add the RAM. Then double that, and that's probably what you're going to be looking at once you add the RAM in, depending on how ham you want to go on RAM and if you can find a good deal or not. But it is what it is. It's first world problems, as they say. But the other thing too with it is, it's the home labbing community, and the home labbing hobby is one of those things that you're never done. You're never satisfied. Even though you think you have a sweet setup and you're never going to need to upgrade again, you find something that makes you just want to upgrade, and you get that itch again, and you just got to upgrade. Or maybe some hardware fails or something and you have to upgrade. But whatever the case may be, it's a revolving cycle. But that's how it is, with any kind of hobby. You always find yourself putting money into it. But that's kind of the point. It's part of the fun. So going into the last thing, I'm starting to feel bad about how much I've been ripping on like tech YouTubers, but man, did they just get ripped a new one. And the reason I bring this up is not because to boost my own ego in the fact that, see, I'm not the only one that's saying this, but the fact that like what they mentioned is like so applicable to me, and like I totally feel them. So basically, here's essentially what they're saying. They wanted a side-by-side comparison to their 2015 MacBook Pro compared to one of the newer MacBook Pros, either a M1 or an M2. But rather than doing like photography or video related, which is like all the YouTubers do, actually do something with like, say virtual machines, which I think would be really cool. And personally, I've watched a lot of like tech reviews on the new MacBooks, and I have not once seen a single review talk about how it handles virtual machines, which if you're someone like me, like that's something that you care about. Obviously I have, servers that I can run virtual machines on all day, but, sometimes you want to have a virtual machine on your local machine. Like if you're just trying to test something, or maybe, I guess even in my case, being away from home isn't even an excuse. But for a lot of people that don't have, a mini data center at their house, if they're away from home or even at home, and they want to, experiment around with another operating system, a virtual machine is the way to go. And most of the time you only have one device, so that machine's gonna have to do. So if it can't run virtual machines, well, I don't know what you're gonna do. But anyway, I thought that was really cool that they, wanted to see something with virtual machines. But they go on, because they say, all I'm seeing in these reviews is benchmark testing related to quote unquote, I'm quoting, they put this in quotes, real world stress tests heavily skewed to video and photo editing, which obviously, they're video editors by trade. That's what they do. So obviously they're going to lead more into that because that's, what they do. But, they go on to say that those tests don't measure stuff I do, which I'm like, yes, man, preach. And I think I can talk for most of you that you don't do photo and video editing on the regular, right? I think when I mentioned in my first, when I first kind of brought up this topic about tech YouTubers and kind of, saying how they're out of touch, this was one of the things that I brought up, right? That most people, if they do any kind of video editing or photo editing, it's like maybe once a year, maybe a couple times a year after like a family vacation or something like that, and they're putting together like a collage or a slideshow or something to, kind of put it all together in one nice package or something like that. You're not doing video editing on the reg or regular. So it's not, necessarily applicable to stuff that they do. And they go on and talk about, how they want to run Windows on the same machine, but obviously Boot Camp isn't supported anymore on Apple Silicon, which, in fairness, I'm not sure who's really to blame for that. Because yes, Apple killed off Boot Camp, which is a shame. But at the same time, Windows for ARM is an absolute joke. Like, Microsoft's really got to get it together on that. So it's kind of, the chicken and the egg kind of thing. Like, Apple needs Microsoft to do it. And, like, well, I guess it's not really chicken and the egg. But, like, the problem is the only way that you can get Boot Camp is if you have Windows built for ARM. But Windows built for ARM doesn't really exist, like, in the way that, Windows exists. Like, you can't just download Windows for ARM and run it, really. Like, it's not the same process as, downloading an ISO of Windows from Microsoft's website. So, there's that. So, like, I get where he's coming from. I just wanted to, point that out. I'm not the only one that's getting mad at tech YouTubers for kind of being out of touch with us normal folks, and, heavily skewing in their test results to be, while they say, quote unquote, real world, not really applicable to us normal human beings. So I just thought I'd, bring that up. Maybe it entertained you. I know it definitely entertained me, hearing other people having similar complaints to my own. It always feels good when you realize you're not alone in something like that. So I think that's pretty much going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you leave a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share it with a friend or family member who you think would be interested in, learning about pushing to prod, going full send to prod, or maybe learning about Guacamole to improve their Homelab setup, or even to be able to remote into your machine from anywhere in the world, assuming you have a VPN, of course. And if you have any questions about this episode, or you have any questions that you want me to answer in a future episode, feel free to leave that in a rating and review with your question, or you can email me at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or click the link in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.